In June of 1989, the Douglas County Equipment Auction in Omaha, Nebraska, baked under a sun that turned the gravel lot into a skillet. The air smelled of diesel and dust and old hay. 200 men in feed caps and faded jeans moved between rows of tractors, hay balers, and pickup trucks, fanning themselves with sale bulletins, spitting tobacco onto the rocks, talking about prices and rain. At the back of the lot, separated from the decent vehicles like a patient nobody wanted to treat, sat a 1954 Chevrolet 3100 pickup. The paint had faded from Chevy blue to something closer to primer gray. Both tires on the driver's side were flat, the rubber cracked and weeping. The passenger door hung slightly open, held by one rusted hinge. Birds had built nests in the cab. Someone weeks or months ago had written the word runs on the dusty windshield. 3 question marks followed it. Those 3 question marks told you everything you needed to know. Wendell Castleberry stood by that truck for almost 20 minutes before the auction reached the last row. He was 41 years old, 6'1", with thick shoulders and hands that had been working metal for 19 years at Omaha Steel Works. His hair was the color of wet sand going gray at the temples. He wore a denim shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, work boots scuffed at the toe, and a wedding ring that had thinned over time from being twisted between his fingers when he was thinking. He was thinking now. He walked the length of the truck twice. He bent down and looked at the frame. He ran a flat palm along the bed rail. He opened the hood, which fell at a crooked angle, and stared into the engine bay for a long time. The inline 6 was packed with dirt, the wiring brittle as straw, the carburetor crusted shut. To anyone walking by, it looked like junk. To Wendell, it looked like the year he was born. The auctioneer almost skipped it entirely. He stood on the wooden platform at the end of the lot, microphone in one hand, gavel in the other, sweat running down his neck. All right, folks, we're coming to the end here. Got a 1954 Chevy pickup, part of the Ashworth estate. Hasn't run since looks like 1971, based on the expired plates. Sold as is no guarantee, probably better for parts than anything else. Do I hear $100? Silence. A breeze pushed a flyer across the gravel. Come on now, somebody needs a project truck. $50. More silence. A few chuckles rose from the crowd, men shaking their heads ready to move on. $25 for a genuine piece of Americana. Wendell raised his hand. 100. The auctioneer blinked. The crowd turned slowly like a single animal lifting its head. The auctioneer recovered his voice, climbing back into rhythm. I have 100. Do I hear 150, 150 anywhere? Nothing. The breeze again. A horsefly buzzed past somebody's ear. 100 going once. 200, Wendell said. The auctioneer paused. A few men laughed openly now. A voice from the back called out, Sir, you don't have to bid against yourself. Wendell did not look at him. 300. That broke the dam. The laughter rolled across the lot, real laughter, the kind that carries, the kind that makes other men stop and look. The auctioneer banged his gavel quickly before Wendell could go to 4. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $300. Folks, that concludes today's sale. Thank you for coming. Wendell walked to the payment table. He pulled out his wallet, counted 15 $20 bills onto the wood. It was almost everything he had in his checking account. He signed the title transfer with a steady hand. The clerk gave him a receipt and a look that said, I hope you know what you're doing. He did not know, not yet, but he believed. That was when Hollis Rutherford found him. Hollis was 38 years old, owner of Rutherford Ford on Dodge Street, the biggest truck dealership in Douglas County. He wore pressed khaki slacks, a navy polo shirt with the dealership logo stitched in gold on the chest, and a watch that caught the sun every time he raised his arm. He drove a brand new 1989 F-15 OXLT Lariat that he traded in every 12 months for the latest model, and he had opinions about everything, especially trucks, especially other men's trucks, especially trucks owned by men he considered less successful than himself. Wendell Castleberry, he said loud enough for the men around the payment table to hear, "Did you just spend $300 on that pile of rust?" Wendell folded the receipt into his shirt pocket. "I did. Do you know what $300 could buy you at my dealership?" Wendell said nothing. "That's a down payment, a real down payment on a real truck. A 1989 F-150 fuel injection, air conditioning power, steering power brakes, power windows, AM/FM cassette. Something that actually starts when you turn the key." "I can fix this one." Hollis laughed. It was the same big performing laugh that everyone within 30 feet could hear. He stepped closer and placed his hand on Wendell's shoulder. His palm warm through the denim, his rings cool against the bone. "When? That truck hasn't run in 18 years. The engine is probably seized. The wiring is shot. The frame is probably rotted clean through. You just paid $300 for something worth 50 in scrap metal. I've been selling trucks for 15 years. I know what I'm talking about." Wendell looked at the hand on his shoulder. He looked at Hollis's face, smooth and tan and certain. He looked past him at the Chevy waiting at the back of the lot. "I appreciate the advice. When come by the dealership Monday morning? I'll get you into something that won't embarrass you. 0 down, 7 years to pay. Your wife will thank you. I'm keeping the truck." Hollis shook his head, still smiling the smile of a man who had already won and just wanted to be polite about it. "Your funeral, buddy. Just remember I tried to help you." He walked back to his own truck, climbed up into the air-conditioned cab, started it, and pulled away with country music thumping softly through the speakers. Wendell stood very still until the F-150 disappeared past the front gate. Then a voice spoke from beside him, low and gravelly. The voice of a man who had smoked Lucky Strikes for 40 years and stopped because the doctor told him to, and not because he wanted to. "Castleberry, you pick the 54. Wendell turned. Sutton Pritchard, the floor foreman from Omaha Steelworks, stood there in a sweat-stained work shirt, his white hair cropped close, his blue eyes set deep in a sun-darkened face. Sutton was 62. He had been Wendell's supervisor for 19 years. He almost never spoke unless something needed to be said. "Yes, sir." "Same year you were born." "Yes, sir." Sutton nodded slowly as if confirming something he had already worked out. "I watched you walk that truck twice before you raised your hand. You didn't buy that truck, son. You rescued it." Wendell did not know how to answer that. Sutton reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small business card with the Steel Mills logo on it. He wrote something on the back with the stub of a pencil and handed it over. "Come see me Tuesday after your shift. There's a lathe in the back bay nobody uses after 7. Supervisor authority. I'll sign you in. You're going to need it." He walked away before Wendell could say thank you. Wendell stood holding the card. On the back, written in pencil, were 3 words, "Patience over money." He looked at the Chevy. He had not even figured out how to get it home yet. The tow took until dark. Wendell rented a flatbed from a cousin in Council Bluffs and ratchet-strapped the truck down himself in the falling light. By the time he rolled into his driveway on Maple Street, the street lamps had clicked on, and moths were already battering the porch light. The house was small, white, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a detached garage in the back that Wendell had wired and insulated himself the year Travis was born. The lawn was patchy from a dry spring. A basketball hoop hung crookedly over the garage door, the net long since rotted away. Joyce Castleberry was standing in the open garage when he backed in. She was 39. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tired braid, the kind she wore home from night shifts at St. Joseph's Hospital, and she still had her white nursing shoes on. She had her arms crossed over the front of her cardigan. She was not yet angry. She was waiting to decide. Wendell killed the truck. He climbed down, walked around the front of the flatbed, and stood facing his wife of 17 years. "You said you were going to pick up parts," she said. "I did. I picked up all of them." She did not laugh. "Wendell, we talked about Travis's tuition. We have it written down on a piece of paper in the kitchen drawer. You know exactly what is in our savings account, and you know exactly what that boy needs in August. And you spent it on this. Most of it, not all of it." "How much?" 300. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the truck on the flatbed. The faded blue paint, the hanging door, the empty bird nest visible through the cracked windshield. "It does not even run." "Not yet." The back door of the house opened. Travis Castleberry, 17 years old, stepped out onto the small concrete pad. He wore a Nirvana t-shirt 3 sizes too big and basketball shorts and white socks pulled up his calves. His hair was longer than his father liked. He stopped halfway across the yard when he saw the truck. He looked at the truck. He looked at his father. He looked at the truck again. "Dad, tell me that is not yours. That is mine." "Oh my God. Travis, my class is going to laugh me into the ground when school starts. Do you know that?" He turned around and walked back into the house. The screen door slapped shut behind him. Joyce did not move. The garage light buzzed above them. A dog barked somewhere down the block. After a long time, she uncrossed her arms. "My father had a dream once," she said. Her voice was quieter now. "He left me and my mother when I was 9 because the dream was bigger than we were. I do not know if you remember me telling you that. I think I only told you once." "I remember. I have spent my whole adult life afraid of men with dreams, Wendell. I am not your father, Joyce." She nodded once, not in agreement, just in acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked back into the house. She did not slam the door. That was somehow worse. Wendell slept in the garage that night in a folding chair beside the flatbed, with a thin wool blanket across his legs and the truck looking down at him in the dark. He could not sleep, and at some point around 2 in the morning he found himself thinking about his father. Avery Castleberry had been a maintenance mechanic at the Swift & Company packing plant in Council Bluffs for 32 years. He had been the kind of man who came home with grease worked permanently into the creases of his knuckles, who could not get his fingernails clean even on Sunday morning, who kept a coffee can full of bolts in the basement and could find the right one by feel. Wendell was 17 years old the summer Avery first showed him the inside of an engine. The garage in Council Bluffs had a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord, and his father stood under it in a sleeveless undershirt, his forearms ropey, his eyes patient. "There are 3 things I want you to believe in, Wen," he had said, his hand resting on the warm valve cover of an old Plymouth. "Honest work, tools you can trust, and fixing what you have instead of buying what you want. The first 2 are easy. The third one is the one that will get you laughed at." Then he had shown his son a 235 cubic inch inline-6, the same engine that sat under the hood of nearly every Chevy truck built between 1941 and 1962. 6 cylinders in a row, a cast iron block heavy as a sin, mechanical valve lifters, a carburetor you could rebuild on a kitchen table. No computers, no vacuum lines snaked into 1,000 sensors, just metal and fuel and spark doing what they had been engineered to do. You don't need an engineering degree to fix this engine, Wen. You just need ears that know how to listen. Every knock means something. Every miss means something. The engine is telling you what is wrong. Most men have stopped listening to anything but their own opinions. Don't be most men. That was how Wendell had grown up. He could rebuild a carburetor at 15. He could diagnose a misfire by sound at 17. He had rebuilt his first full transmission at 19. When Avery died of lung cancer in March of 1978, the doctors blamed 40 years of breathing chemical fumes from the packing plant to kill floor. Avery had left his son three things: the garage in Council Bluffs, a full set of snap-on hand tools accumulated across 2 decades, and a 1947 Dodge pickup that he had maintained personally for 30 years. The Dodge had 340,000 miles on the odometer and started on the first turn of the key every morning. Wendell still drove that Dodge to work. People in Omaha had given up commenting on it. There was one more thing his father had left him. Inside the toolbox, taped to the underside of the top tray, Wendell had found a folded piece of yellow-lined paper after the funeral. One sentence, one line in his father's blocky handwriting. "Don't forget, machines have souls if you are patient enough to listen." Wendell had carried that piece of paper in his wallet for 11 years. It was there now behind his driver's license, soft at the folds, the ink slightly faded. He sat in the garage chair that first night with the truck in front of him and Avery's note in his hand, and he understood for the first time that he had not bought the truck for himself. He had bought it for his father. He was 41 years old and he was a son finishing a sentence. He started in the morning. The first week of July was relentless. Heat shimmered off the streets. Cicadas screamed in the maples. Wendell took 2 weeks of vacation he had been saving for 3 years and dragged the truck off the flatbed inch by inch using a come-along ratchet anchored to a tree. He set the Chevy on jack stands in the center of the garage. He swept around it. He stood and looked at it. Then he began the assessment. The 235 inline six was seized solid. He confirmed it the moment he tried to turn the harmonic balancer with a breaker bar. 18 years of moisture and stillness had welded the rings to the cylinder walls. The wiring harness, when he tugged on it, shed insulation like dry skin. The brake lines snapped between his fingers, brittle as breadsticks. The bedwood had rotted through in 2 places. The cab floor was spongy under his boots near the driver's side door. The radiator was a sieve. But the frame, when he pulled himself underneath on a creeper and ran a flashlight along every weld and crossmember, was solid. Not rusted through, not bent, not patched. Original 1954 box steel. The body beneath the surface rust was straight. The glass was all intact. The doors closed when you lifted them onto their hinges. Someone decades ago had loved this truck enough that the bones of it had survived. "Whoever you were," Wendell said to the empty cab, "you took care of her once, I see it." He did not know yet that anyone had heard him. Somewhere far west, in a place he had never been, the wind moved over 80 acres of grass beside the North Platte River. The grass had been moving like that since 1968. It would move like that for 19 more years before he ever stood in it. The afternoon of the second day before he ever turned the first wrench on the engine, the camera of memory moves elsewhere, and we should follow it. November 1971. A field outside Scottsbluff in the western Nebraska panhandle. The sun was low and orange. A man named Bennett Ashworth, 58 years old, sat in the cab of a 1954 Chevrolet 3100 pickup, the same truck that would sit on jack stands in Wendell Castleberry's garage 18 years later, and tried to keep his hand from shaking. Bennett had worked the pipelines for 16 years, from 1952 to 1968, laying line across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, the Dakotas, anywhere a pump station was rising, and a foreman needed a man who would work double shifts without complaining. He had saved his overtime in cash sealed in coffee cans hidden in the rafters of the garage. He had never told his wife. Cordelia would have wanted to buy a new house with it, or new furniture, or take a trip. Bennett had wanted something else, and he had not known how to explain it, and so he had not. The week before, the doctor at the VA in Lincoln had told him that his heart was giving out. The valves were shot. He probably had a year, maybe less. Maybe he would not make it to spring. He had not told Cordelia that yet either. He sat in the cab of his truck and wrote a letter on lined yellow paper, the same kind Avery Castleberry would later use to write a note to his own son. The handwriting was unsteady. Bennett wrote for almost an hour. When he was done, he folded the letter twice, wrapped it in a sheet of canvas with a deed and a stack of money, and placed the whole bundle into a metal toolbox. He drove the truck to a fabrication shop in Gering, Nebraska, where a friend who owed him a favor welded a false wall into the front of the truck bed. 4 inches of hidden space running the full width of the cab. Sealed forever, or until someone wanted to find it badly enough. Bennett drove the truck home. He did not tell his wife. He never did. 3 months later, on a February morning in 1972, he made coffee for Cordelia, kissed her on the forehead, walked out to the garage to start the truck, and died of a heart attack on the cold concrete floor with his hands still on the door handle. That was Cordelia Ashworth's 57th birthday. She sold the truck the next month to an estate liquidator. She moved to Arizona. She remarried in 1985. She lived. She forgot some things and remembered others. The truck began its long, quiet wait. 18 years passed. The truck moved through hands, auctions and backlots. Forgotten. Finally, on a Saturday in June of 1989 in Omaha, a man who had never met Bennett Ashworth raised his hand and said $100. Wendell did not know any of this, of course. Not yet. He pulled the engine out at the end of July 1989. He used a chain hoist bolted to the rafters of his garage. He laid the long iron block on a sheet of plywood on the concrete floor and disassembled it piece by piece across 2 evenings, labeling every bolt with masking tape and a permanent marker photographing each step with a Polaroid camera he had borrowed from his neighbor. The cylinders were scored but not destroyed. He could bore them oversize. The crankshaft had surface rust but no deep pitting. The block itself, the heart of the matter, was salvageable. He took the measurements. He wrote them down in a spiral notebook with a green cover that he kept on a shelf above the workbench. He drew diagrams. He made lists. In the second week of August, on a Tuesday evening, after his regular shift, he carried the block, the crankshaft, and 3 connecting rods through the back door of Omaha Steel Works in a steel pushcart at 7:30 in the evening. Sutton Pritchard was waiting for him by the lathe. The bay was empty. The big sodium lights buzzed overhead. The smell of cutting oil and steel filings hung in the air. Sutton had cleared a workbench and laid out micrometers, dial indicators, a torque wrench, and a thermos of coffee. "You bring everything." Block crank 3 rods. The other 3 rods passed inspection. "Good. Set them there. Pull up that stool." Wendell pulled the stool over. Sutton handed him a cup of coffee. "I want to tell you something, son. You don't have to answer. You just have to listen while I tell you." Wendell nodded. 1952. Korea. I was a private with the 1st Marine Division. We were dug in along a ridge above a valley in the middle of December. The trucks kept breaking down. We had this one kid in our unit, mechanic from the Midwest, who could fix anything with a wrench and a coat hanger. He pulled a Jeep out of a ditch under mortar fire one afternoon. He fixed the radio on our supply truck in the middle of a blizzard. He saved my life twice that winter. Not with a gun, with a wrench. Wendell held his coffee with both hands. When that boy came home in 1954, his neighbors thought he was crazy because he wouldn't buy a new car. He told them he had seen enough thrown away things to last him a lifetime. He worked at the Swift packing house for 32 years and never owned a car newer than 10 years old. He died in 78. Sutton looked up. His eyes were wet. Avery Castleberry, your father. Wendell did not move. He never told me he had a son in Omaha. I figured it out 2 years after you started working for me. You sound like him when you talk about engines. Same words, same pauses. Wendell turned his face away. He wiped his eyes with the back of his oily hand and left a streak of black across his cheekbone. He did not say anything. He could not. Sutton clapped a hand on his shoulder. Let's bore some cylinders, son. Your father would want it done right. They worked until midnight. The block was beautiful when they were done. Wendell drove home in the Dodge in the dark, and the cab smelled like coffee and cutting oil, and something he had not been able to name for 11 years. He cried twice on the way home. He was not ashamed. Hollis Rutherford drove past the house on a Sunday morning in September of 1989 on the way to brunch with his wife at the country club. He saw the Chevy on jack stands in Wendell's open garage hood, up parts laid out on a tarp on the lawn. He slowed his F-150 and rolled the passenger window down. Castleberry still messing with that anchor. Wendell on his knees beside the front bumper did not look up. How much you into it now? 1,000, 1,500? You could have bought a decent used truck for that. Wendell tightened a clamp on a brake line. He did not answer. In the passenger seat, Hollis's son Tobias, 16 years old in a Cornhuskers t-shirt, stared at the truck through the open window. He did not laugh. He did not look at his father. He just looked at the truck, at the way the parts were arranged on the tarp in perfect order, at the man in his oily denim shirt who would not look up. When the F-150 pulled away, Tobias turned and watched the Chevy through the back window until the corner blocked his view. Wendell looked up only after they were gone. The last week of October 1989. A cold front had moved through the night before. The maples along Maple Street had gone copper and gold. Wendell was in the garage at 2 in the morning, a small space heater whirring near his feet, the inline 6-block sitting reassembled on a rolling engine stand when the door from the kitchen opened. Joyce stood there in her bathrobe and her white nursing socks, with a thermos of coffee in her hands and a quilt over her arm. She walked across the garage without saying anything. She pulled up the other folding chair. She sat down. She poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to him. Wendell, I called my mother today. He took the cup. He waited. I have not spoken to her in 12 years. I always told you that was her fault. It was not. Most of it was mine. He set the cup down on the workbench. I asked her why my father left. She told me he did not leave because of the dream. He left because he never really believed in it. He told her once that he was tired of pretending. He was tired of working for something he did not have the patience to finish. He just wanted out. Joyce's voice was steady. I have been afraid of you for 19 weeks, Wendell. I have been afraid you were going to disappear into this truck and come out the other side a different man. I have been afraid you were my father. She put her hand on the engine block. It was still slightly warm from where Wendell had been working on it. You are not my father. My father quit. You are still here at 2 in the morning in October. You have never quit at anything in 17 years of marriage. She looked up. Her eyes were wet and her mouth was steady. Finish it. I am here. Wendell stood up. He pulled her up out of the chair. He held her against his chest for a long time with the smell of motor oil between them and the space heater whirring at their feet. When he finally let go, he kissed the top of her head once. She picked up the thermos. She walked back to the house. He did not sleep that night. He worked on the wiring harness until the sun came up. Across town in a 5,000-square-foot house on a cul-de-sac with a 3-car garage, Hollis Rutherford drove past Wendell's neighborhood at 4 in the morning on his way home from a sales banquet in Lincoln. He saw the single light burning in Wendell's garage. He slowed down. He did not stop. He shook his head and smiled to himself and drove on. Inside that garage, a man knelt beside a rebuilt engine block and worked a strand of new copper wire through a brittle old loom with hands that had not stopped moving since 2 in the afternoon. The truck had been waiting for 36 years to tell its story. It was only 10 months into telling it now. Most of the story was still to come. The money, the deed, the letter, the widow. But none of that would matter. None of it would even be possible without what was happening at 4 in the morning on Maple Street in late October of 1989 in a garage no bigger than a tool shed with a single light bulb burning and a man bent over an engine finishing a sentence his father had started a generation before. Hollis drove home and slept in a king-size bed under Egyptian cotton sheets. Wendell worked until dawn. The truck waited. It had time. June 1990, 11 months after he raised his hand at the auction. The garage on Maple Street smelled of fresh gasket sealant and new copper wire, and Wendell Castleberry stood with his hand on the door handle of a 1954 Chevrolet 3100 pickup that no one alive had heard run since 1971. He did not pray. He was not a praying man, but he closed his eyes once the way his father used to close his eyes before pulling the cord on a temperamental outboard motor on the Missouri River, and then he turned the key. The starter motor whined. The engine coughed. Nothing. He waited 15 seconds. He pumped the throttle once. He turned the key again. The whine, then a deeper cough, then silence. Wendell did not panic. He had expected this. He climbed out, walked to the front of the truck, looked into the bay, made a single small adjustment to the choke linkage, walked back, sat down, turned the key a third time. The inline six caught. It coughed for 2 seconds, ran rough for 5 more, then smoothed out as fresh oil reached the bearings and the carburetor settled into rhythm. Smoke poured white from the tailpipe for almost a minute, then went clear. The engine idled. Wendell sat with both hands on the steering wheel and listened. It sounded exactly like his father's old Plymouth had sounded in the garage in Council Bluffs when he was 17 years old exactly. 24 years had collapsed into one sound. Behind him, the door from the kitchen creaked open. Travis Castleberry, 18 years old now, 3 months away from leaving for the University of Nebraska, stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame. His hair was still too long. His t-shirt was still too big. But his face was different than it had been the previous June. "Dad." "Yeah, you did it." Wendell shut off the engine. He climbed down. He looked at his son. Travis crossed the garage in 3 strides. He did not say anything. He just put his arms around his father awkwardly, the way an 18-year-old boy hugs the man he is starting to understand he will be one day. Wendell held him back. He smelled the cheap drugstore aftershave his son had started wearing, and underneath it, the smell of the boy who used to fall asleep in his lap during Cornhuskers games on the couch. Neither of them spoke. Joyce watched from the kitchen window with a coffee cup at her mouth, and she did not let either of them see her crying. That August, Wendell drove Travis to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, 60 miles east on Interstate 80. The truck was loaded with 2 cardboard boxes of clothes, a milk crate of books, a desk lamp Joyce had wrapped in a bath towel, and a small black and white television set Wendell had bought used from a coworker for $25. 40 minutes into the drive, halfway between Lincoln and Omaha, the engine sputtered, lost power, and died on the shoulder of the highway. Wendell coasted onto the gravel. The temperature outside was 94 degrees. Heat rolled off the asphalt in waves. Travis stared at his father. "Are you kidding me? Today of all days?" "It happens." "Dad, my orientation starts in 3 hours. Then we should start fixing it." Wendell got out, popped the hood, and stood there in the white sun looking down at the engine. Travis sat in the passenger seat with his arms crossed for almost a full minute. Then he sighed, loudly opened his door, and walked around to stand next to his father. What is it? Fuel line. The new rubber I put on in March has come loose at the carburetor inlet. Right there. Can you fix it? I can fix it. Question is whether you want to learn how. Travis looked at the engine, then at his father, then back at the engine. Show me. For the next 2 hours on the shoulder of Interstate 80, with semi-trucks blasting past them at 70 miles an hour, and the metal of the truck so hot they could only touch it through rags, Wendell taught his son how to diagnose a fuel starvation issue, how to check the line, how to clean the inlet, how to replace a worn clamp using the spare he kept zip-tied to the underside of the dash, how to bleed the line, how to listen to the engine and know whether it was getting what it needed. When they finally pulled into the dormitory parking lot in Lincoln, Travis was 45 minutes late to orientation. His shirt was streaked with grease, his hands were black, and he was smiling for the first time in 3 months. That night in the dormitory, he sat on his narrow, extra-long twin bed and wrote a postcard to his mother. He used a ballpoint pen he had to borrow from the boy in the room across the hall. Mom, I learned more today on the shoulder of I-80 than I will learn in any class this semester. Tell Dad, thank you. Tell him I am sorry for what I said about the truck last summer. Love, Travis. Joyce kept that postcard taped to the inside of her recipe box for the rest of her life. The years that followed moved the way years move when you stop counting them. 1991, 1992, 1993. The Cornhuskers won national championships. Travis joined a fraternity. Wendell got a small raise at the steel mill. Joyce was promoted to charge nurse on the night shift at St. Joseph's. The 1947 Dodge developed a transmission whine, and Wendell rebuilt the gearbox over a long weekend. In February of 1992, his hands cracking from the cold, even with the space heater running. The Chevy ran. That was the simple truth of it. It ran in the rain. It ran in the snow. It ran in the heat that broke records in the summer of 1993, when the Missouri River flooded and parts of Council Bluffs went underwater, and Wendell drove the Chevy across the Hamilton Boulevard Bridge with 300 pounds of sandbags in the bed to help shore up a friend's basement. The engine did not miss. The brakes did not fade. The simple cast-iron heart of the thing did what it had been engineered to do. In June of 1995, on a Saturday morning at the Sinclair station on Saddle Creek Road, Wendell was filling the Chevy's tank when an F-150 Lariat pulled up to the pump on the other side. The driver door opened. Hollis Rutherford stepped out 15 pounds heavier than he had been in 1989. Gold watch still flashing, the same dealership polo. Only now the embroidered logo had been updated to reflect his expansion into a second location in Lincoln. He looked across the pumps at the Chevy. The paint was still faded. The bed still had the same minor dings. But the engine ticked quietly as it cooled, and the tires were good, and the man pumping gas into it had the calm posture of someone who had not had a single mechanical surprise from his vehicle in 3,000 miles. Castleberry, still not tired, huh? Wendell did not look up from the pump handle. Truck runs fine. 6 years, $300. You could have bought a real one by now. Wendell topped off the tank. He hung the nozzle back on the pump. He twisted the gas cap into place. He looked at Hollis once across the white concrete and the smell of gasoline, and he did not say anything. Hollis got back in his F-150. He pulled away. That was the last conversation they would have for 9 years. Wendell got into the Chevy, started the engine on the first turn of the key, and drove home to Joyce. It would have been easy to think the story was over. It was not. In March of 1997, Joyce Castleberry, 47 years old, Charge nurse, mother of one wife of 19 years, found a lump in her right breast during a self-exam after her shower on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, she had a diagnosis. The tumor was invasive. The surgery had to happen within 3 weeks. The bill after insurance covered 70% came to just over $18,000. She did not tell Wendell on Thursday night. She told him Friday morning sitting across the kitchen table from him in her white nursing scrubs before her shift with 2 cups of coffee between them and the morning light slanting through the curtains. Wendell put down his coffee cup. He stood up. He walked around the table. He pulled his wife out of her chair and held her against his chest for almost 3 minutes without speaking, and she could feel his heartbeat through his work shirt fast and steady, the way it had been the first time he had ever held her in the parking lot of a Council Bluffs roller rink in October of 1972. That night, after Joyce had gone to work, Wendell sat at the kitchen table and laid out every bill, every bank statement, every line of credit they had. He calculated and recalculated. He had $4,700 in savings. The line of credit on the house was already drawn down from the new roof in 1994. He could refinance, but it would take 6 weeks, and they did not have 6 weeks. He could sell the truck. A collector had stopped him in the parking lot of the hardware store the previous summer and offered him $8,000 cash on the spot. He had said no. The man had left a business card. The card was in the kitchen junk drawer behind a roll of masking tape. The phone rang at 9:47. It was Travis calling from Chicago, where he had taken a job 2 years earlier as a junior engineer at a manufacturing firm. Joyce had told him that afternoon. "Dad, sell the truck." "Travis?" "I am serious. There is a guy. The card is in the drawer, Mom told me. Call him in the morning. He will give you $8,000. With your savings, we are almost there. I can wire $2,000 from my account by Monday." "Travis." "Dad, this is not about the principle of the thing. This is not about Grandpa. This is Mom. This is Mom." Wendell did not answer for a long time. "Travis, I have to go." He hung up the phone. He sat in the dark kitchen for almost an hour, his hands flat on the Formica table. Then he stood up, walked to the bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, and took out a small wooden box. Inside the box, wrapped in a square of blue felt that Joyce had stitched the edges of when they were first married, was a gold Rolex Datejust wristwatch. His father had bought it in 1968, the year Bennett Ashworth had bought his 80 acres in Scottsbluff, although Wendell did not know that name yet. Avery Castleberry had saved for 30 years from a packing plant maintenance salary. 3 decades of skipping lunches, of bringing thermoses of coffee from home, of refusing the union men's offers to going on horses at Aix-Sarbonne. 3 decades for one good watch. He had never worn it. He had kept it in a felt-lined box on his dresser for 10 years, and then he had died, and Wendell had inherited it, and Wendell had worn it exactly once on his wedding day, and then had put it back in the box and not touched it for 19 years. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the watch in his palm. The gold caught the bedside lamp. He turned it over. On the back, his father had paid extra to have a single line engraved. "For my son, time is what we have." Wendell drove to Lincoln the next morning. He walked into a high-end jeweler on O Street that specialized in vintage Swiss timepieces. The owner, a man named Lyman Whitcomb, examined the watch under a loupe for almost 20 minutes. It was a limited production model from a short run that year. Solid 18-karat case. Original papers. The owner offered $22,000. Wendell signed the bill of sale without negotiating. He drove home with a cashier's check in his shirt pocket. He paid the surgical center on Monday morning. The surgery happened on March 19th. The tumor was removed cleanly. The margins were clear. Joyce was released after 3 nights. He did not tell her about the watch. It was June 3 months later that she opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, looking for a pair of wool socks for an early morning fishing trip with Wendell to Lake McConaughey, and she found the wooden box. She knew the box. She had seen it on the day of his father's funeral. She lifted the lid. The blue felt was still there, indented in the shape of the watch. The watch was gone. She sat on the edge of the bed in her bathrobe and held the empty box on her lap. And she cried for almost an hour, the kind of crying that is not sadness. Not exactly, but something deeper and more complicated than sadness. The crying of a woman who has just understood the full weight of what her husband is. When Wendell came in from putting the cooler in the truck, he found her like that. He sat down next to her on the bed and put his arm around her shoulders. My father gave me that watch because he wanted me to know that time was the only real currency he had ever owned. She nodded against his shoulder. I used it for the most valuable time I have ever known. Joyce, he would have understood. She turned her face into his neck. She did not say anything for a long time. You should have told me, Wendell. I know. I would have stopped you. I know. That is why you did not tell me. Yes. She squeezed his hand. They drove to Lake McConaughey. They caught 4 walleye. They did not talk about the watch again. November of 2001. Cold. The first real snow of the season had fallen the week before and had not melted. Wendell was 53 years old. The garage on Maple Street was bigger than it had been in 1989 after he had paid a contractor to extend the rear wall 8 feet to accommodate a second workbench and a small heater. The Chevy sat in the bay on its tires, freshly waxed with a tarp draped over the bed against the snow. He was asleep at 1:40 in the morning when he smelled smoke. He sat up so fast that Joyce woke up beside him. The smoke detector in the hallway started screaming a half-second later. He looked out the bedroom window. The garage was glowing orange from the inside light leaking around the edges of the door, smoke curling up from the eaves. He ran. He did not put on shoes. He did not put on a coat. He ran across the yard barefoot in the snow, in his pajama pants, in a t-shirt, and Joyce ran behind him in her bathrobe with the cordless phone in her hand already dialing. 911, there is a fire, 804 Maple Street, hurry. The garage door was hot to the touch. Wendell threw it open. A wall of black smoke hit him in the face. He could see the flames at the back climbing the wall behind the old chest freezer, eating the insulation he had stapled up himself in 1972. The electrical panel in the corner was popping. The Chevy sat in the middle of the bay with the tarp starting to smoke. He went in. He went in with no shoes and no shirt and one breath of clean air in his lungs. And he ran around to the driver's door of the truck, threw it open, climbed in, took the parking brake off, dropped it into neutral. He could not start the engine. The battery cable had been disconnected since October for the winter. He had done that himself. He climbed back out, ran around to the front, put his shoulder against the grill, and pushed. The Chevy weighed 3,200 pounds, but Wendell had rebuilt the transmission himself the previous winter, and the gears were fresh, and the truck rolled. It rolled a foot, then 2, then 5. The siren of the first fire truck was coming up the block. A massive arm grabbed Wendell from behind and pulled him backward. Captain Boyd Tillinghast of Engine 22, 6'4", 310 pounds, 22 years on the Omaha Fire Department, had his arm across Wendell's chest and was dragging him out of the open garage door. Sir, you are out. You are out. We will get the rest. Sir, you cannot go back in. My truck. Sir, my truck is in there. Wendell tried to break the grip. He could not. Captain Tillinghast had pulled men out of grain silos and house fires for 2 decades, and Wendell was a strong man. But Captain Tillinghast was stronger. Joyce was on the front lawn now, screaming his name, the cordless phone forgotten in the snow at her feet. Two more firefighters had come around the side of the garage with a hose. The Chevy was halfway out. Wendell broke free of Captain Tillinghast for half a second, just long enough to lunge back to the truck, get his shoulder on the front bumper, again and push. The truck rolled the last 6 feet out of the garage and into the snow of the driveway. The tarp was smoking, the paint on the hood was blistered in 3 places, but it was out. Wendell collapsed on his knees beside the front tire. His right forearm from wrist to elbow was burned. Second degree, he would learn later. The skin was already blistering. He had not even felt it. The garage went up. The fire ate the rest of it in under 15 minutes. The Chevy sat in the driveway in the falling snow alive. In the emergency room at St. Joseph's, where Joyce had worked the night shift for 24 years, the doctor on call wrapped Wendell's arm in burn dressing and gave him a tetanus shot. Joyce sat in the chair beside the gurney with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not look at her husband. "You could have died, Wendell." "I know. For a truck." "It is not the truck, Joyce." She turned her head and looked at him. The fluorescent lights were unkind to both of them. She was 51. He was 53. They had been married for 29 years. "Then what is it? Tell me, because I have lived with it for 12 years and I still do not understand." He looked at the ceiling tiles. The burned cream was already starting to numb the pain in his arm. "I do not know how to explain it, Joyce. I just know there is a story in that truck that has not finished telling itself. I have been listening to it for 12 years. I have not heard the end of it yet." She did not respond. She held his uninjured hand with both of hers. They sat in the emergency room until almost 5 in the morning. The garage was a total loss. The insurance paid out $47,000. Wendell rebuilt it himself the following spring, larger, better insulated with a properly grounded modern electrical panel installed by a licensed electrician this time. Travis came home from Chicago for 2 weekends to help him hang the new drywall. 2 years later, in the spring of 2003, the dot-com bust caught up with Travis. The manufacturing firm where he had worked for 8 years downsized. He was 30 years old. He had been engaged to a woman in Chicago for 10 months. She broke it off 3 weeks after he lost the job. He gave up the lease on his apartment, packed his things into a U-Haul and drove home to Maple Street. He stayed in his old bedroom for 4 months. He did not speak much. He slept until 10. He watched the morning shows with Joyce and pretended to read the want ads in the World Herald. He lost weight. Joyce watched him from across the kitchen and did not push him. One night in June, around 10 o'clock, Wendell was in the new garage polishing the chrome on the Chevy's bumper with a soft rag. The door from the breezeway opened. Travis stepped in. He still wore the same university sweatshirt he had been wearing for 3 days. He had not shaved in a week. He pulled up a folding chair and sat down beside the truck. "Dad, yeah, I owe you an apology about 1997, about telling you to sell the truck." Wendell stopped polishing. He set the rag down. He turned to face his son. "You do not owe me anything, Travis." "I do. I did not understand. I am 30 years old and I am sitting in my childhood bedroom and my whole life feels like it is on fire, and I finally understand why you would not sell this truck. Tell me, really, why did you keep it, after all of it, after the fire?" Wendell sat down on a wooden stool beside the truck. He wiped his hands on his pant leg. He looked at his son across the small space between them in the new garage, with its bright fluorescent lights and its smell of fresh paint and clean concrete. "When Grandpa died, I went through his shop in Council Bluffs. I went through everything he had ever owned, and I realized that every single thing he left behind was something he had repaired. The ditch, the garage itself, the tools, me. Especially me. He repaired me, Travis. He took a teenage boy who was angry at the world and he showed him how to listen to an engine, and somewhere in there, he became a man who could love a woman and raise a son. Travis was very still. If I sold this truck, I would be saying he was wrong about everything, about all of it. I would be saying the years he spent putting me back together did not matter. And I cannot do that, Travis. I would rather die in a fire than do that. Travis dropped his head. His shoulders shook once. He got up out of his chair and crossed the 4 feet between them and put his arms around his father, and this time he held on for a long time the way a 30-year-old man holds his father when he finally understands what was given to him. 3 weeks later, Travis took a job with a smaller engineering firm in Denver. The salary was less than his old one. The work was harder. He took it. By Thanksgiving, he had met the woman he would marry the following October. The Chevy ticked quietly under the streetlight whenever Travis came home for the holidays. The years kept going. April 2007. Wendell was 59 years old. His hair had gone fully gray. The packing plant where his father had worked, had been torn down 2 years before replaced by a self-storage facility. The Dodge had been retired to honored stationary duty in the corner of the garage, and the Chevy was now his daily driver 18 years into the second half of its life. He was washing it on a Saturday morning in late April, a bucket of warm, soapy water at his feet, a clean cotton chamois in his hand when he stopped halfway through wiping down the bed rail and looked at the truck from the side. He set the chamois down. He walked around to the back. He looked at the bed from the rear. He squinted. He walked back to the side. He squatted down. He looked at the line where the bed sat on the frame. The bed was sitting half an inch high on the driver's side, maybe a little more. Not enough that anyone else would have ever noticed it. Not enough that Wendell himself had noticed it in 18 years. He stood up. He stared. 18 years, he said quietly. 18 years I have driven this truck, and I never saw that. He pulled a tape measure from the toolbox on the bench. He measured the bed height from the frame rail at all 4 corners. The front 2 corners sat exactly 2 inches higher than the rear 2 corners. He stood in the spring sunlight in his own driveway and held the tape measure in his hand, and a feeling moved through his chest that he had not felt since the night he had run barefoot into a burning garage. The truck was not done telling its story. He did not know it yet. But somewhere in the middle of that bed, 300 miles from the 80 acres of grass that had been waiting in Scottsbluff since 1968, a letter that had been folded in an envelope for 36 years was about to be read by the second man it had ever belonged to. May 2007, Saturday morning. The garage on Maple Street smelled of new sawdust and old motor oil. Wendell Castleberry, 59 years old, stood beside his 1954 Chevy with a tape measure in one hand and a sheet of new oak boards leaning against the workbench beside him. He had bought the oak 2 weeks earlier from a mill in Plattsmouth. He had been planning this replacement of the bedwood since the previous winter. He pulled the last of the rotted original boards out of the bed. He brushed away decades of dust and chaff. He took the tape and measured the inside dimensions of the bed from the tailgate to the front wall. 94 inches. He frowned. He went around to the outside of the truck and measured again from the back of the cab to the closed tailgate. 98 inches. He stood there looking from one number to the other, and the world went very quiet in the way the world sometimes goes quiet just before everything is about to change. 4 inches. 4 inches of space that did not exist on the inside but did exist on the outside. 4 inches of metal that had been hidden in plain sight under his hands for 18 years. He climbed into the bed. He knelt down. He knocked on the front wall with his knuckles, the panel that pressed against the back of the cab. Hollow on the cab side, solid on the bedside. He sat back on his heels in the empty bed of the truck. He had a feeling he could only later describe as the moment when a long song you have been hearing for years finally reveals its last verse. He went to the workbench. He picked up the angle grinder. He came back to the truck. He plugged the cord into the extension on the garage wall. He pulled on his safety glasses. He squeezed the trigger. The cutting wheel screamed. Sparks fanned across the bed in an arc of orange. Wendell cut along the bottom seam where someone had once welded a false wall in place, somewhere far away from this garage, somewhere in another decade with a different machine and a different purpose. The wall came free. He set the grinder down. He pulled the panel away from the truck. Behind it, in a space exactly 4 inches deep and running the full width of the bed, sat a rectangular metal toolbox, wrapped first in a sheet of heavy gray canvas and then sealed inside a rubberized tarp the color of an old life preserver. The tarp was perfectly dry. The canvas underneath, when he peeled it back, was the same canvas that had been used by railroadmen to wrap their tools in the 1960s. He carried the toolbox out of the bed of the truck. He set it on the workbench. He stood looking at it for almost a minute before he reached out and unlatched it. Inside, in 3 neat stacks held by aged rubber bands that had not yet rotted through, was money. United States currency, 20s, 50s, and hundreds. He pulled out one of the 20s. The series date read 1963. He thumbed through another stack. Nothing newer than 1969. He counted it 3 times. He kept getting the same number, $8,400. Beneath the money sat a manila envelope, slightly yellowed, sealed with a single strip of brown packing tape. He cut the tape with his pocket knife. He shook out the contents onto the workbench. A property deed typed on official stationery from the Scotts Bluff County Register of Deeds, dated September of 1968. 80 acres of grassland along the North Platte River. The buyer was a man named Bennett Ashworth. The deed had been signed and notarized. It had never been recorded. Wendell had never seen anything like that before in his life. And beneath the deed, folded into thirds, was a handwritten letter on lined yellow paper. The same kind of paper his father had used. He sat down on the wooden stool. He unfolded the letter. He read it. "My name is Bennett Ashworth. If you are reading this, I am probably dead, and you have found what I hid." He read about the pipelines, about 16 years of overtime saved in coffee cans hidden from a wife who would have wanted a kitchen remodel, about 80 acres bought in cash in September of 1968, about a heart that had begun to fail in the fall of 1971, about a plan to retire in 1972 and surprise a woman named Cordelia with a cabin on the North Platte, about a doctor who said spring was unlikely. He read the final paragraph twice. "If you found this, the truck served you well. That Chevy never let me down. Whoever cared enough to fix it and keep it deserves whatever I left behind. The land is good, wide open, quiet, everything I wanted. Tell my wife I am sorry I kept secrets. Tell her I was trying to give her something better." Bennett Ashworth, November 1971. Wendell sat on the stool in his garage with the letter in one hand and his father's note still folded in his wallet against his hip. And for the first time in his adult life, he understood that 2 men he had never properly met had been speaking to him in the same language for more than 3 decades. He drove to the Douglas County Records Office that Monday morning. He drove to the public library in the afternoon. By Tuesday evening, he had pieced together the rest. Bennett Ashworth had died on February the 8th, 1972, in his own garage in Gering, Nebraska. Heart attack. 58 years old. The obituary had run in the Star-Herald. His widow Cordelia had sold the truck the following month to an estate liquidator in Scottsbluff. She had moved to Phoenix, Arizona later that spring. She had remarried in 1985 to a man named Howard Bramwell and become Cordelia Bramwell. Bennett's date of death, February 8th, was Cordelia's birthday. Wendell sat in the library reading room and lowered the microfiche reader handle and stared at the green glowing screen for a long time. The land in Scotts Bluff County had remained in Bennett Ashworth's name for 36 years, untouched, not recorded into the next generation, not sold, not paid taxes on, although the county had absorbed the parcel into unclaimed property status in 1989, the same year Wendell had bought the truck. The same year. He went home and told Joyce everything that night. She listened to him for almost 2 hours at the kitchen table without interrupting once. When he was done, she reached across the table and took both of his hands in hers. Wendell, you were not crazy. For 18 years, I thought maybe you were a little crazy. You were not. I might still be crazy, Joyce. You are, but not about this. He laughed, and then he covered his eyes with his hand, and she did not say anything else. The next morning, he called Maxwell goodnight. Maxwell had grown up 2 blocks from Wendell on 6th Avenue in Council Bluffs. They had played Little League together in the summer of 1958. They had lost touch for 30 years. Maxwell had become a real estate and probate attorney with a small office above a coffee shop on Dodge Street. They had reconnected at a class reunion in 1995. Maxwell was 45 years old with thinning hair and reading glasses he kept on a chain around his neck. Wendell laid the deed, the letter, and a typed summary of what he had found on the conference table. Maxwell read everything without speaking. Then he took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. This is the strangest thing that has ever crossed my desk. Can it be done? Done, yes. Easy, no. The widow died without a will in 1984. No children, no siblings. Property fell into unclaimed status. As the legal owner of the vehicle where the deed was concealed, and as the finder of the original instrument you have standing. But the county is going to fight you. Hard. This is exactly the kind of case that triggers a fraud review. How long? 9 months? Maybe a year. Are you ready for that? Yes. Then let us start. They started. The process took the precise 9 months Maxwell had predicted. There were 3 hearings in front of the Scotts Bluff County probate judge. There were 2 letters from the state attorney general's office. There were 47 pages of documentation Wendell had to assemble across the summer of 2007, including a handwriting analysis of Bennett Ashworth's letter compared against 3 signatures the county still had on file from his 1968 land purchase. The hardest part was a woman named Margaret Sanborn. Margaret was 48, the senior administrator of the Scotts Bluff County Office of Unclaimed Property, and she did not believe Wendell's story. She sat across the table from him at the first hearing in July of 2007 in a beige business suit with a manila folder open in front of her and reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. Mr. Castleberry, I have been doing this job for 19 years. In 19 years, I have seen 47 attempts to claim unclaimed real property through what claimants describe as discovered documentation. 46 of them were fraudulent. The 47th was inconclusive. Now you walk in here with a letter and a deed and a story about a hidden compartment in a 1954 pickup truck. Yes, ma'am. You understand how this looks? Yes, ma'am. I'm going to recommend a full criminal review. Wendell did not flinch. Do what you have to do, Mrs. Sanborn. The story is the same either way. She did. 6 weeks of investigation followed. An FBI document examiner in Kansas City verified Bennett Ashworth's handwriting against original employment records pulled from a pipeline company archive in Tulsa. 2 retired pipeline workers, both in their 80s, signed affidavits remembering Bennett bragging about his secret land purchase in the summer of 1968. The First National Bank of Jering produced microfilmed records showing a cash withdrawal in September of 1968 in the exact amount that matched the price on the deed. In February of 2008, Margaret Sanborn called Wendell at home on a Tuesday morning. Mr. Castleberry, I am authorizing the transfer of the property to your name. Thank you, Mrs. Sanborn. I owe you an apology. You do not owe me anything. I do. I have spent 19 years assuming the worst about people who walk into my office with stories. You are the first one in 19 years who has made me wonder if I have been wrong about how many of them were telling the truth all along. The line was quiet for a moment. Thank you for fighting me hard, ma'am. The story needed to be tested. She hung up. Wendell sat at his kitchen table with the phone still in his hand for almost 5 minutes. The 80 acres of grass along the North Platte River, untouched since 1968, belonged to him. Appraised value, March of 2008, $185,000. A week later, on a clear, cold Saturday in March, Wendell loaded the Chevy with a sleeping bag, a thermos of coffee, 2 ham sandwiches in wax paper, and his father's old wool blanket from the trunk in the basement. He kissed Joyce. He drove west, 450 miles, 9 hours on Interstate 80, with the great sweep of Nebraska unrolling beneath the hood, past Lincoln, past Grand Island, past the Sandhills. The sun set behind him as he turned north on Route 71 outside of Kimball, and by the time he reached Gering, it was full dark. He slept in the cab of the truck that night, parked at the edge of the land. He did not want to see it until morning. He woke at 6. He climbed out into the cold dawn. He walked to the fence line. 80 acres, rolling grass, copper and gold in the early light. The North Platte River ran along the southern edge, slow and brown and wide. The Wildcat Hills rose blue in the far distance to the south. There was no sound except the wind moving through the grass and the call of a single sandhill crane crossing the sky above him. It was exactly as Bennett had described it. Wendell walked out into the middle of the property. He stood in grass up to his knees. He turned a slow circle. The wind moved his hair. He stood very still. "Bennett," he said out loud to nobody, "I am here. You picked well." He sat down on the ground. The cold of the earth came through his jeans. He pulled his father's wool blanket around his shoulders, and he cried for the first time in almost 30 years. He cried for Bennett Ashworth, who had bought this land and never seen it. He cried for his own father, who had spent 32 years on the kill floor of a packing plant, breathing chemicals that had eaten his lungs, and who had never owned a piece of land of his own. He cried for Cordelia Bramwell, who was somewhere in Arizona that very morning, who did not know yet that her dead husband had been waiting under a sheet of welded steel for 36 years to give her something. He cried because he was 59 years old and his wife was alive, and his son was happy, and a truck he had paid $300 for had carried him to a place he had not known he was being carried to since the day he had raised his hand at an auction in 1989. The sun rose. He stayed in the grass until the wind warmed and the sandhill cranes began calling across the river. Then he got back in the truck and drove home. He made his decisions in the spring of 2008. He sold 40 acres of the property to a third-generation rancher named Carl Hennessy, whose family had been running cattle along the North Platte since 1907. Carl needed the grass for his herd. The price was $95,000 fair to both men. Wendell used the money to pay off the mortgage on the Maple Street house, the last of Joyce's medical bills, from a follow-up procedure in 2005, and to put the remainder into a savings account in both their names. The other 40 acres he kept. Over the next 2 years, working summers and weekends with Travis and a contractor named Lloyd Erskine, out of Scottsbluff, Wendell built a 1-bedroom cabin on the property. Cedar frame, tin roof, a wood stove for winter, a wide front porch facing south toward the river, a small detached workshop in the back. He built it on the exact spot as best he could figure from Bennett's letter, where Bennett would have built his own. The cash, the $8,400 in old bills, he did not keep. He drove the bills to a currency dealer in Lincoln in April of 2008. The dealer offered him $9,200 for their collector value because pre-1969 small bills in that condition had become rare. Wendell thanked him and declined. He took the cash instead to the office of the Nebraska Veterans Association in downtown Omaha. He had pulled Bennett's military records the previous month. Bennett Ashworth, United States Navy, Korean War. 2 combat tours, honorable discharge, 1953. Wendell handed the cash to the development director and asked for a single thing. I want this set up as a named fund. What name? The Bennett Ashworth Fund. For veterans of the Korean War and their widows, specifically for medical expenses not covered by the VA. The director, a retired Marine named Garrison Tate, did not speak for almost 10 seconds. Then he said, Mr. Castleberry, we will honor that name as long as this organization exists. In June of 2009, the Rutherford Ford dealership in Omaha closed. The big sign on Dodge Street came down a month later. Local newspapers covered the bankruptcy. Hollis Rutherford had been over-leveraged on commercial real estate when the recession hit, and the dealership's 20-year line of credit was called in by the bank. He lost the dealership, the house in the gated subdivision, the cul-de-sac, the lake place in Minnesota, the F-150 he had bought in March. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in West Omaha. His wife filed for divorce in November. Wendell read the story in the World Herald over coffee on a Sunday morning. He did not feel anything triumphant. He just folded the paper and went out to the garage and washed the Chevy. 2 years passed. In April of 2011, a man in his late 30s knocked on the screen door of the cabin in Scottsbluff County on a Saturday afternoon. Wendell, 63 years old, had been splitting cedar in the side yard. He came around to the porch with the axe in his hand. The man on the porch was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and wore a clean denim shirt and work boots. He had a small folder under one arm. Mr. Castleberry. Yes. My name is Tobias Rutherford. I am Hollis Rutherford's son. Wendell set the axe carefully against the porch rail. Tobias? I remember you. I was in my father's truck the day you stood beside that Chevy at the gas station on Saddle Creek Road. I was 16. I have thought about that truck for 22 years. Wendell opened the screen door. Come in, son. I will make coffee. Tobias sat at the small kitchen table. Joyce was visiting her sister in Council Bluffs. The cabin was quiet except for the coffee pot. Mr. Castleberry, my father is in a memory care facility in Lincoln. He was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's 18 months ago. He has lost most of the last decade. He does not always remember me. He does not always remember he is divorced. He does not always know what year it is. Wendell sat down across the table. But he remembers you every week. He remembers the auction in 1989. He remembers the Chevy. He talks about it constantly, Mr. Castleberry. The nurses think it is some kind of obsession. I think it is something he never finished saying. Wendell looked down at his hands on the table. Would you come see him? Tobias, please, I am asking as a son. He is 60 years old. He has Alzheimer's. He may not have the language for it much longer. Wendell looked up at the young man across his kitchen table. He looked at the small folder under Tobias's hand. He looked out the window at the cottonwoods along the river. Yes, the memory care wing of the Lincoln Estates Care Center was painted in soft yellows and creams. The hallway smelled of disinfectant in the cafeteria's afternoon coffee. Tobias led Wendell to a sunlit corner room with a view of a small garden. A man sat in a wingback chair by the window, wearing a navy cardigan and pressed khaki slacks. His hair combed neatly, his hands folded in his lap. He had lost 40 pounds since the last time Wendell had seen him. Hollis Rutherford looked up when they entered the room. His eyes were the same blue they had always been. The certainty was gone from them. Toby, Dad, I brought somebody to see you. Hollis looked at Wendell, his brow furrowed slightly. He looked at Wendell for a long time slowly, the way a man looks at a face when his memory is trying to load. Then his eyes cleared. Wendell Castleberry. Yes, Hollis. The Chevy, you fixed it. I did, Hollis. Hollis nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. Then he reached out with his right hand and touched Wendell's forearm. His grip was light, his skin was thin. Sit down, please. Wendell pulled a chair over. Tobias stood by the window with his hands behind his back. Wendell, I was wrong. Hollis! No, let me say it. I have not been able to say it out loud for 30 years. Let me say it while I still have the words. Wendell sat very still. I sold trucks for 30 years. I told myself I was selling success. Wendell, I was selling debt, 7-year loans, compound interest, trade-ins every 2 years for the next loan. I had hundreds of customers, Wendell, hundreds. None of them owned anything when they were done, including me. Hollis's eyes were wet. You were the only man I ever met who actually owned his truck. You owned it the day you bought it. I hated you for that, Wendell. I hated you for showing me what I could have been. Wendell put his other hand over Hollis's hand on his forearm. Hollis, we both believed in what we believed in. You were not a bad man. I was not a kind one. You were doing the thing you knew how to do. Hollis began to cry. Not loudly, just steadily, the way old men cry when they finally let themselves. I am sorry, Wendell. It is all right, Hollis. It is all right. They sat together for almost an hour. Hollis drifted in and out of clarity. He talked about a dog he had owned as a boy in Plattsmouth in 1959. He talked about his mother's pancake recipe. He asked Wendell 3 separate times whether the Chevy was still running. Wendell answered yes 3 times. When Wendell finally stood to leave, Hollis caught his sleeve. Wendell, take care of that truck. I will. In the parking lot, Tobias stood beside Wendell at the door of the Chevy. The April wind moved the new leaves on the elms above them. Mr. Castleberry, thank you. For the first time in 5 years, my father is going to sleep tonight. Wendell got into the truck. He drove the 70 miles home to Scottsbluff in silence. He did not cry. But once somewhere west of Grand Island, he laughed out loud at nothing in particular, and the sound of his own laughter in the cab surprised him. He retired from Omaha Steelworks in October of 2010 at 62 years old with 40 years on the job. Sutton Pritchard, 83, came to the retirement luncheon in a clean white shirt and a black tie. He stood up at the end of the meal and handed Wendell a small manila envelope. Inside was a single black and white photograph taken in March of 1972 in front of the old maintenance bay at the Swift packing plant. Avery Castleberry, 52 years old, lean and grease-stained, stood beside Sutton Pritchard, 47, both of them leaning against the front fender of a 1947 Dodge pickup. Both men were smiling. The picture had been taken 1 week before Avery's death. Your father fixed my Dodge that week, Castleberry. I never paid him. He died before I had a chance. I am paying you now, son. Wendell could not speak. He shook Sutton's hand with both of his. He and Joyce moved to the cabin in Scottsbluff the following spring. Joyce kept her hospital pension. They lived simply. They were not rich. They were not poor. They were enough. The Scottsbluff Antique Auto Show, held every September in a meadow east of town, drew collectors from 6 states. In September of 2015, Wendell drove the Chevy down and parked it in his assigned spot in the row of 1950s pickups. He set out 2 folding chairs and an old camping cooler. He sat in one chair with a paperback novel. Joyce sat in the other with a needlepoint hoop in her lap. A woman walked over in the late morning. She was perhaps 70 years old, silver hair cut short. She wore a pale blue cardigan and held a paper cup of coffee in her right hand. The hand trembled slightly. What a beautiful truck. Thank you, ma'am. My first husband had one just like it. The same color, same year. He loved that truck more than he loved most people, including me, I sometimes thought. Times. She laughed gently. Wendell set down his book. What was your husband's name, ma'am? Bennett. Bennett Ashworth. He passed in 1972. I sold his truck a month later to settle the estate. I have regretted it for 43 years. Wendell sat very still in his chair. He looked at Joyce. Joyce had stopped stitching. Ma'am, are you Cordelia Ashworth? The woman's face changed. The coffee cup in her hand tilted slightly. I was. I am Cordelia Bramwell now. I remarried in 1985. How do you know my name? Wendell stood up. He set his book on the chair. Mrs. Bramwell, I bought your husband's truck at an auction in Omaha in June of 1989. This is that truck, and I have something he wanted you to have. She did not move. She stared at him. Her mouth opened slightly. The coffee cup tilted further. Joyce stood up and gently took the cup from her hand and set it on the cooler. Come sit down, dear, Joyce said. Come sit down. Cordelia sat down in Joyce's folding chair. Wendell pulled the photocopy he had carried in his wallet for 7 years from behind his driver's license. The original of Bennett's letter sat in a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Omaha. The copy was soft at the folds and faintly yellow. He handed it to her. She read it. Her hands shook the whole time. When she finished, she did not lower the paper for almost a minute. Tears moved down her face into the collar of her cardigan. He was saving for retirement, she said. I knew he was saving for something. I never knew what. I never knew how much. After he died, I thought maybe it was just a story he told himself. I did not know it was real. I did not know. She lowered the letter. She looked up at Wendell. Her eyes were soft and very old. You found the land. Yes. You went there. Yes. You built the cabin he wanted. Yes. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. She opened it slowly. From behind a faded driver's license, she removed a small black and white photograph and held it out. In the photograph taken in 1962, Bennett Ashworth, 48 years old, stood beside the same 1954 Chevy in the driveway of a small house in Goring. Cordelia, 44, stood next to him in a yellow dress and a kerchief. Both of them were smiling. Bennett had his hand on the hood of the truck the way another man might rest his hand on a horse. I have carried this in my wallet for 53 years, she said. I think today I can put it down. She handed Wendell the photograph. You kept his truck running. You found his land. You built his cabin. You did everything he did not get to do. I hope that is all right with you. Wendell could not speak. He took her hand. Mrs. Bramwell, it is perfect. She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her free hand. Joyce sat on the other side of her with one arm around her shoulders. Bennett would be happy to know, Cordelia said softly. He would be happy. They sat in the meadow for almost 3 hours. Cordelia talked about Bennett. She talked about Howard, her second husband, who had passed in 2009. She talked about a daughter she had never had and a niece who lived in Tucson. Joyce held her hand the whole time. The September sun moved across the row of old trucks. Other collectors came by, asked questions, moved on. When Cordelia finally stood to leave, she did not let go of Wendell's hand. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. She walked away across the meadow toward the visitor parking lot slowly, but with her shoulders straight. Joyce watched her go and did not let go of Wendell's other hand. The years after that were quiet and good and slow. Joyce passed in March of 2022 at 72 from a stroke that took her in the middle of the night while she slept in her own bed beside her husband. husband of 49 years. Wendell spread her ashes on the hill behind the cabin, the one with the view of the river bend. He planted a small dogwood there the following spring. Travis came home from Denver every 6 weeks to check on his father. He brought his wife Audrey, who had taught Joyce to make sourdough in 2016, and they brought their son. The boy was 12 in the summer of 2024. His name was Avery Castleberry II. In June of that year, Wendell, 76 years old, stood in the workshop behind the cabin with his grandson beside him. The Chevy was up on the lift. The engine, the same 235 inline six that had first turned over in a closed garage on Maple Street in June of 1990, idled quietly at 800 revolutions per minute. The boy held a wrench in his small hand and waited. "Eva Avery." "Yes, Grandpa." Wendell reached into the chest pocket of his work shirt. He pulled out a small wristwatch. It was a stainless steel Timex mechanical manual Win with a worn brown leather strap. He had bought it for $47 in 1998, a year after he had sold his father's Rolex. He had worn it every day since. He held it out to his grandson on his open palm. "Avery, do you know why I want you to have this watch?" "Because I am named after great-grandpa." "That is part of it. Listen, the best watch is not the most expensive one. The best watch is the one that marks your time honestly. Yours, Avery, not somebody else's. Do not let anyone tell the story of your life for you. Mark your own time." The boy took the watch in both hands. He looked up at his grandfather. "I will, Grandpa." Wendell helped him strap it on. The leather was too big for the boy's wrist, but they punched a new hole in it together with an awl, and it fit. That evening, Wendell and his grandson sat on the porch of the cabin. The Chevy was parked in front of them in the yard's 60 acres of grass spreading out beyond it to the river, the sky going gold and pink behind the Wildcat Hills. The boy held a glass of cold lemonade. The old man drank black coffee from a tin cup he had owned since 1978. The Sandhill cranes were calling somewhere south. "Grandpa, tell me again how much you paid for the truck." $300 in 1989. In 1989. "And everyone laughed at you." "They did, Avery." "Were you scared?" Wendell thought about that for a long moment. "I was scared the whole time, son, every single year. I was scared in 1989. I was scared in 1990. I was scared the night your grandmother had her surgery. I was scared the night the garage burned. I was scared the day I opened that letter." The being scared is not the part that matters. The part that matters is that you keep going anyway. The boy nodded as if he had just been told something important. The sun went down. The 1954 Chevrolet 3100 pickup, faded blue, $300 truck, sat in the yard of a small cabin in western Nebraska on land that had been bought in cash in 1968 by a man named Bennett Ashworth and waited 36 years to be lived on. The engine was cold now. The chrome of the front bumper held the last orange light. Somewhere far away from that porch in an apartment in West Omaha, an old man with Alzheimer's named Hollis Rutherford slept peacefully under a thin blanket. Somewhere else in a memorial garden in Arizona, the urn of a woman named Cordelia Bramwell had been placed beside her second husband, with the photograph of her first husband and a 1954 Chevy tucked into the inside pocket of the burial dress at her own request. Somewhere a fund set up in 2008 had given out almost $300,000 to Korean War veterans and their widows for medical bills not covered by insurance. And the founder of the fund, who never put his own name on it, sat on a porch with his 12-year-old grandson and watched the day end. Wendell Castleberry reached into his front pocket and pulled out a folded square of yellow-lined paper, soft at the creases. His father's note. He had carried it for 46 years. He handed it to his grandson. "Read this, Avery, out loud, just once." The boy unfolded the paper carefully. He read in a clear, high voice, "Don't forget, machines have souls if you are patient enough to listen." The boy looked up at his grandfather. "What does it mean, Grandpa?" Wendell smiled. He put one hand on his grandson's shoulder. He looked out at the truck and the grass and the river and the last gold light of the day. "It means," he said, "that the things people throw away are sometimes the things you were supposed to find. It means that patience is not waiting. It means that patience is trust. It means that if you fix what you have instead of buying what they tell you to want, you will be the kind of man other men come looking for someday, the way your great-grandfather was." The boy thought about that. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his own pocket. "I am going to keep this, Grandpa." "That is right, son. You are going to keep it, and one day you will give it to somebody else." The night came down soft over Scottsbluff County. The Chevy ticked quietly as the metal cooled. The river ran. The grass moved. $300 in June of 1989 at the back of an auction lot in Omaha. Not a bad investment.